like a song, but from here to Manila we'll be hitting the drums, yeah. So shake it up and beats it like no more drama. And check the to Philippines, no one that. The world keeps talking, but we ain't walking. We keep on dancing, that's how we rock it. 7,107 islands of BBC, pieces of heaven.
Piliin mo rin ang Pilipinas. 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 Kapulo ang kwintas ng pelas. Piliin mo, yakapin mo, kayamanan niyang likas. Piliin mo ang Pilipinas. Kapulo ang kwintas ng pelas. Piliin mo, yakapin mo, kayamanan niyang likas. Piliin mo ang Pilipinas. Piliin mo ang Pilipinas. Piliin mo ang Pilipinas.
The sights and sounds of the Philippines, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, a big hand for El Gama Penumbra. Welcome back, everyone. They always give a very inspiring performance. It's really amazing to see the creativity of our local artists. Once again, I'd like to remind everybody to participate in the forum. Send your questions using Pigeonhole Live. Also, we are on live stream on Rappler. You can check your Twitter or your phones to see what they're reporting on, or you can go straight to their website. And also, if you want to tweet anything about what you're witnessing today, use the hashtag Shell the Power in Progress. Once again, that's hashtag Shell Powering Progress. Well, back to business once again. Our next panel is called Implications for Asia. We will be taking a closer look into our region and hearing from our speakers on forecasts, challenges, and opportunities in the area of energy, water, and food. Please allow me to present our panel. Welcome back, Simon Henry, the Chief Financial Officer of Royal Dutch Shell. Simon, please take the seat. Dr. Brahma Chellaney, Professor of Strategic Studies, India Center for Policy Research. He is a 2012 Asia Society Bernard Schwartz Book Award recipient for Water, Asia's New Battleground. Please welcome Dr. Vinod Thomas, Director General of Independent Evaluation of the Asian Development Bank, and the Honorable Carlos Jericho Petilla, Secretary of the Philippine Department of Energy. Hello, Ikot. Now let me take my seat. And we go, of course, first with Simon. You talked earlier about the challenges, the growth in Asia, but the challenges as well. And it was discussed in the first panel, also touched on the first panel. Go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sess. I've heard a lot of great stories this morning already. So what I'll do is just recap around 5 points before moving to my colleagues. Firstly, the challenge is real. The demographics, global economic growth, they're all good things, but they will put stress on resources. We talked about food, energy, and water, but think of others: the carbon limit, land, commodities such as metals and minerals. We all have to work together on this. The second point is Asia matters. Shell is a company that has two parents, Royal Dutch Petroleum and Shell Transport. Both were born in Asia 120 or so years ago. Both grew because of Asian markets. Both are growing today as a single company now because of what's happening in Asia. China alone is driving about half of the demand growth for energy today. But more importantly than that, Asia is becoming increasingly a source of innovation, of technology development. The number of patents issued in many related areas in countries such as Korea and Japan, China, and hopefully increasingly the developing economies in this region, this is where the solutions to some of the challenges will be developed as much as in California or Stuttgart. Thirdly, I think it is important, the points made by Dr. Brian Walker earlier about resilience are vital. And I'll give you one particular area. It's really about energy source security of supply. When we look at demand growth for energy, it is going to grow. It's going to grow 40-50% in the next 40 years. And there's huge debate in the West about renewables versus fossil fuels. It's not a question of A versus B. We need everything. We need diversity to ensure security, to get an affordable mix of energy. And clearly, from a Shell perspective, we produce more gas than oil now. We're an energy company. We see a very significant role for gas, but as part of a broader energy mix, that gas can play a really important role because of its availability, its low cost, and its relative environmental acceptability. But it needs to mix with everything else, including efficiency and different ways of using energy. Which brings me to my fourth point, and you've seen the stats. 66% of the world energy consumption is in urban environments. It's moving up because more people will live in such environments, but also because the concentration of consumption of all resources tends to gravitate towards new urban centres. Some amazing stats I hear, a Metro Manila equivalent every 2 months. That's a very significant opportunity as to the way the developing world is urbanizing to create new ways of consuming energy. It is quite possible that new transport systems and ways of moving both goods and people that emerge in developing worlds can be retrofitted back to the developed world, maybe even teach the Americans how to be more efficient about using energy in their urban environments. This is where the future will be developed. We could see a future, a fossil-free future within urban environments for transport. That could make a huge difference over the next 30 to 40 years. My fifth and final point really is about the importance of policy, and it's great to have the Government Representation Secretary with us today. Everywhere that we work as Shell, we are working with governments, providing energy products and services to customers, and it is vital that businesses, governments, and civil society work together in addressing these issues. And government policy really matters. It matters to create the environment in which business can take the right actions for the long term. And I think Laurie mentioned, and Brian mentioned earlier, about policy. Sometimes politicians' horizons are only short, 2-3 years at most. And energy policy in particular, but everything we're talking about today, that policy is measured in decades, not in years. So it is important that governments are working and advocating to their own voters, their own taxpayers, to civil society in general about what needs to be done for the longer term. So governments play a really key role in creating the environment where other people can bring some of the solutions, and we have the clarity and stability that we look for. So my final point is, it's about 200 years ago, a gentleman called Thomas Malthus in my own country in the United Kingdom became known partly as one of the world's first economists, but for suggesting that in a world that then had less than 1 billion people, there was no way that the world could sustain more than that number of people without enduring misery and difficulties. So it's pretty much the same problem we're looking at. But clearly 200 years ago, Malthus was wrong. He was wrong primarily because of human innovation, entrepreneurial spirit, energy, and what we were able to create that he could not envisage at that time. Now, I'm an optimist. we as Shell are optimists that people in the room, but society in general, has that innovative capability to address the problems that we face. That's what today's about. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Now let's go to Brahma. You have written a book with a very powerful title, Asia's New Battleground. Brahma, can you tell us more of what you see happening in Asia in relation to water?
Water is the sustainer of life and livelihoods. Water, in fact, is the world's healthiest drink. According to a recent cognitive test study, drinking plain simple water, as Henry is drinking, boosts mental performance immediately. Michelle Obama, in fact, has launched a campaign to persuade Americans to drink more water to stay healthy. Unfortunately, because of rapid economic and demographic transformation, water resources across the world are coming under increasing pressure, especially in Asia. Water is the world's most exploited resource. The dramatic rise of the bottled water industry over the last 15 years testifies to the fact that the era of cheap, bountiful water is over, replaced by a new era of increasing supply and quality constraints. Asia is the world's most resource-poor continent in per capita terms. This is best exemplified by looking at the comparative water picture. As you can see, water resources are very unevenly distributed across the world. The world's driest continent, Asia, paradoxically, is the world's current economic locomotive. This raises the question whether Asia can continue to spearhead global economic growth without mitigating its water crisis. Countries like Canada, Brazil, and Russia are the Saudi Arabias of the freshwater world. They are blessed with extraordinary water wealth. Some of the world's water-poor countries rank among the world's top 15 economies, including South Korea and India. Much of Asia's water is a shared resource. Dependence on cross-border water inflows is high. This makes inter-country cooperation and collaboration essential. Only one country is happily placed, China. China's dependence on cross-border water inflows is one of the lowest in the world, less than 1%. This happened not because of geography, but because of guns. The annexation of the Tibetan Plateau changed the water map of Asia. There are 57 transnational river basins in Asia, but the vast majority of them have no water sharing arrangement or any other type of cooperative mechanism in place. A report reflecting the joint judgment of US intelligence agencies had this warning on possible water wars. Water wars in a political or economic sense are already being waged between neighbors in several sub-regions. In fact, Asia's growing competition over water resources has aggravated disputes over water-rich territories. What is common between Kashmir, Tibet, Central Asia's Fergana Valley, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank? All these territorial issues are as much about water as they are about land. It is important to remember that water is very different from other natural resources. A person can live without love, but not without water. There are substitutes for a number of natural resources, including oil, but there's no substitute for water. Asian economies are importing, even from distant lands, fossil fuels, mineral ores, and resources from the biosphere, such as fish and timber. But they cannot import the most vital of all resources, water. Certainly not in a major or lasting manner. Why? water is essentially local, and it is very expensive to transport water across seas. Not many know this. Water is heavier than oil, about 20% heavier. Therefore, the transport of water across long distances, even by pipeline, is expensive because it entails the use of large energy-intensive pumps to keep the water flowing, unless the movement of water is based on gravity flow. Asia's water constraints have accentuated its energy and food challenges. Rising incomes, for example, have promoted changing diets, especially a greater intake of meat, whose production is notoriously water intensive. On average, beef production is 10 times more water intensive than producing cereals like corn, wheat, and oats. Asian diets have changed fundamentally in almost one generation. The traditional noodles, rice, cabbage diet has become much meatier. Irrigation, for its part, has proved both a blessing and a curse for Asia. Up to the 1960s, Asia was a continent troubled by food shortages and recurrent famines. Then, on the back of an unparalleled expansion of irrigation, Asia in one generation became a net food exporter, opening the door to its rapid economic rise. Between 1960 and 2000 alone, Asia doubled its total irrigated acreage. Now Asia boasts 72% of the world's total irrigated cropland. This success on the food front, on the basis of irrigation, has exacted a heavy price. 82% of Asia's water is channeled for agricultural use. Looking ahead, this level of water use in agriculture is simply not sustainable. Asia has to make water savings in agriculture to quench the thirst of its booming industries and expanding cities. It has to grow more food with less water. This challenge is compounded by the slowing of crop yield growth in Asia. Water constraints in Asia are already affecting developmental decisions. To give you one example, decisions on where to set up new energy or manufacturing plants increasingly are being constrained by inadequate local water availability. These water risks, however, come with business opportunities. Risk, as you know, is a major driver of innovation. Innovation, in turn, is a major accelerator of economic growth. Far-sighted investment decisions can turn the water crisis into an engine of innovation and profit. So how can investors profit? First, consider one sobering thought. The retail price of bottled water today is already higher than the current international spot price of crude oil. In other words, water is not only heavier than oil, bottled water is dearer than oil. We wouldn't like the Arab sheikhs to hear this, that they are selling oil cheaper than bottled water. But this is the reality. Against this background, is it any surprise that an increasing number of investors are beginning to look at water as the new oil of the 21st century? A second point to bear in mind is that the traditional supply-side measures in the water sector are running into natural limitations because water resources are already overexploited across much of Asia. Therefore, we need to develop non-traditional sources of supply and management methods. Take the oil and gas sector, what has proved to be a game changer in recent years. It is the tapping of unconventional sources of supply, like shale and tar sands. Similarly, in the water sector, we need to explore and develop all unconventional options, These options principally are in three areas. The first is using clean water technologies, including distillation technology, membrane technology, and new hybrid technologies like membrane bioreactor to open up new sources of supply, including ocean water, brackish water, and recycled wastewater. The second area centers on securing greater water use efficiency and productivity. And the third area is expanding and enhancing the water infrastructure, to build distribution efficiency and to correct spatial and seasonal imbalances in water availability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brahma. And now we turn to Vinod. Where are we in Asia when it comes to food? How are we responding to the challenges?
Thank you very much, Ses. Good morning, everyone. The one thing that's unique about this panel is remarkable, that there is the interest in water, in energy, and food brought together in one discussion, because it is easy for us to go the line of each sector being the critical constraint. I mean, it reminds me of a question that you can ask if you're driving your car. Which part of the automobile is the most critical one for you to get to the office or anywhere else? Well, without the ignition key, it would be hard. But imagine driving without gasoline, imagine driving without the tires. Any one of the parts would be critical. So at the end of the day, it turns out to be what you don't have, the one that's missing, is going to be the binding constraint. And that could be the tires or the air and the gas in the tires. So here, when you think of Asia and the Pacific in particular and the global setting more generally, it so turns out that energy, water, and food, in their high interrelatedness, each presents a constraint. Now that constraint is different across, say, in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Asian Development Bank, one thinks of the western part, the southern part of Asia, the eastern divided into Southeast Asia and East Asia, that includes China, and the Pacific. And obviously, this is a highly diverse region. But if we were to just take them together, I won't go into the details of these slides, but three mega trends really drive the story. And often we don't talk about this. It may not also be politically not correct, but the population increase is a game changer. The increase in CO2 in the air is also a game changer. And you might wonder about the relationship with those two when it comes to natural disasters, but the change in natural disasters is a game changer. If you look at the third segment of that slide, you will see that what has taken off the page when it comes to natural disasters, the Philippines has had one of the most devastating ones in Haiyan, but the whole region has seen this. It is not the earthquakes and volcanoes. It is the so-called hydrometeorological ones, and among them, floods and storms. And so the question has to be asked, why floods and storms are taking off, and what is the relationship to CO2 and population? Population, because of the vulnerability, including where people locate in harm's way. And CO2, IPCC has, and 95% of the scientists have agreed that this is related to man-made causes that then drive natural disasters. We might not have time to get into this, but these three mega trends superimpose into the story of food, which I'm to discuss today briefly, in giving us a different panorama looking forward. Now, South Asia is different from East Asia. There are many commonalities, but the nexus of food, energy, and water really strike us as extraordinary. Compared to East Asia, the issue of malnutrition, hunger, and especially stunting among children really stand out in the case of South Asia, particularly India. But this slide makes the point that dealing with one, well, in the case of food and agriculture, what is a remarkable thing? It is that agricultural productivity has not kept pace. International institutions like the ADB, the World Bank, etc., have done work recently to show that there's been a secular decline in the investment in agriculture, thinking that that is a done deal and now we move on to urbanization and industrialization. but this was a mistake, and some correction is taking place in reinvesting in agriculture. In the case of the Philippines, dramatic growth rate of the last 2 years, among the top in the world with over 7%, and yet agriculture would be the lagging one. And that per se necessarily is not the cause of concern, but when agricultural imports and dependence on agriculture and the strength of the economy is so much in that and rural areas and employment, then why productivity doesn't keep up is a question. And so that takes us to the issue of investments and so on. There's a lot more we can say on South Asia, but just to show a contrast with East Asia, well, the same issues do have a relevance as well, because when we talk about poverty, the basic yardstick used is a food-based measure. 2/3 to 3/4 of the definition of extreme poverty is based on how much money do you need to buy a basic basket of food, heavily again dependent on cereal. That is big in Asia, that is big in South Asia in particular, but it's also important in East Asia. But aside from that, from this story on East Asia, it is the energy side that really strikes you as extraordinary. Both the needs and the demands. And the needs and the demands, what does it mean you need so much energy? Well, you could do in different ways, but here, East Asia in particular has become the engine of growth of the global economy, and for the world is to deal with the growing needs to employ people, unless Asia, but East Asia in particular, and you can see when Chinese growth rate dips a little bit from extraordinary numbers, a little bit, the entire stock market reacts. Well, that is linked to the energy story, remarkably. So the first two comments from on energy and the next on water feed right into the success of East Asia to maintain the high growth rate. And here, in addition to East Asia needing energy to sustain the high growth rates that are essential for the world, including poverty reduction, there is a story also of the pattern of energy use in East Asia being critical to whether any of this is going to happen through CO2 emissions and climate change. All bets are off if that part is not addressed. Again, back to the interrelationship between food, water, and energy. East Asia, developing world, contributes over a third of the CO2 emissions today. In absolute terms, it's high, but in relative terms, relative to the population, OECD still dominates. But the trends are telling us a story that we need to watch over the next 20 years. Not enough time to go into the details of East Asia. Let me just say a word on the Philippines. I flagged South Asia for the water story. I flagged East Asia for the energy story. Food, the focus I wanted to give, is really brought out by the Philippines, a country which has the benefit of IRRI right here, and actually a lot of new technologies coming in and quite a bit of success. Nevertheless, wanting to raise the productivity in the country, looking at the import picture, and the shifting pattern of imports and exports, especially vis-a-vis Vietnam. But the Philippines' productivity growth rate is still higher than the Thailand situation, but much more can be done to raise productivity in the country. So with water, food, and energy, two words on the next two slides. First of all, putting it together, we need micro responses and we need macro responses. We need both. The micro responses we might dismiss as being too small. I mean, they are boutique projects. We feel good. We have a renewable project. We feel great. We can advertise that. It's not going to make a difference unless it's scaled up. But nevertheless, here, the UN has announced this as a year of family farming. 85% really are small, relatively small farms in the region. How to raise the productivity of that through holistic programs also gets to the question of nutrition, stunting, and so on, and that is a big ticket item. Also research, but equally extension. IRRI was mentioned earlier, but how to get it to the ground so that productivity, for example, right here in the Philippines, can grow again. Micro responses will not be enough, and so to conclude, in a way, the big elephant in the room are the macro policy responses, without which we may feel good with some interesting projects, but you need the support of the macro responses. What do we mean by that? Well, just take one, energy subsidies, 500 billion worldwide, and that is an example of this difficult dilemma of water, energy, and food feeding on each other in terms of the problems they create, trying to solve the food with water that then has an issue on groundwater use, energy, and so on. Reverse that. Are they win-wins that we can turn this dilemma into an opportunity to do all three at the same time? We absolutely have to do it. The example that I give, and not enough time to give other examples, would be energy subsidies. Good for CO2 reductions, good for growth, good for food production because through the welfare effects on people. All three hit at the same time. Well, this is a room of great practitioners. Why not deal with it? Well, that takes us to the political economy. Anything like that hurts somebody. It benefits the country, it benefits the world, but it hurts somebody. Can we mobilize the interest of that somebody to address and confront the win-win options, not just on energy, but on each one of the ones that I mentioned, and in real time to be able to get to the bottom of the dilemma that we face today, that water, energy, and food, three of them call into question the sustainability of growth in Asia and the Pacific and the world. Solutions exist, but will the political economy address them in real time? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vinod. Well, perhaps the busiest man in the Philippine cabinet is right beside me, Secretary Ikot Petilla. So you're right there at the forefront with a balancing act, tough balancing act of managing the water, energy, and food resources of the country. So go ahead with your presentation. I understand it's moving towards sustainable energy development. Go ahead, Secretary.
Thank you, Ses. I've been asked to explain the situation of energy in the country in 7 minutes. And that includes the Meralco rate hike. But anyway, I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. Okay, we basically have in the country a Philippine energy plan, but what's not really emphasized when you go into forums, into talks in the media is really that the green and renewable part where the government is moving into. And I'd like to explain that in this few slides that I've prepared. The issue of LNG and natural gas. We have natural gas. This will start to dwindle in 2024. And the big question is, what do we replace it with? Do we have any new drillings? And the obvious answer at this point is it goes hand in hand with LNG. But do we have an LNG terminal at this point? And that is the big question. I think that Simon was asking, what's the policy of the government towards LNG? And I always tell everybody that when it comes to LNG, there is no master plan for natural gas or LNG in the country. And that's what we're trying to formulate right now before we can actually move on. The areas in the slide that you can see right now are really projects that we have concerning natural gas and LNG. And mind you, I did not invent the names Batman, Batcave. Okay, this just came about. Batman is Batangas, Manila, and Batcave is Batangas, Cavite. We were coming up with policy right now. We have a study right now on master plan, and we're taking into account the private sector who are actually on board already. But I won't discuss that in detail. But I always tell everybody that in energy, because most of the plans that we have here right now for LNG are not going to be completed within the term of the president. And this is the bit of a problem on energy. Energy is a long-term problem. It requires long-term solution. And the only short-term in energy is the tenure of the Secretary of Energy. And we need to actually come up with a plan in order for us to actually finish this. And that's why I'm putting a lot of emphasis on the plan. Where are we going? And that's what's enclosed in the Philippine Energy Plan, which is updated every now and then. These are some of the projects that we're trying to move. Okay, this is actually run by Shell right now, but this will be transferred to PNOC. This is the CNG buses, okay, which up to now is bogged down. We have about 20 plus buses running on CNG. We'd like to expand this to 200 buses. And the only way to do this is really to put up more stations in the Batangas area. And we're putting emphasis on renewable energy. And when I came in about a year ago, okay, there was already the FIT, the feed-in tariff system, and we're trying to push this right now, although this was a bit controversial because we did a reverse. In other words, there are so many flippers, I call them flippers, okay? They get service contract, but nothing really happens with the project. And we tried to avoid them, but by actually telling everybody that if you want to get into the feed-in tariff, you build it first. Whoever gets there first will get the feed-in tariff. So it's kind of a reverse. We thought we were not going to be successful in this because people might boycott this, but as you can see, the wind is oversubscribed, solar is also oversubscribed. The two others, hydro and biomass, is undersubscribed. It has something to do with the price more than anything else. We're also putting up projects for solar, and this is, I had a discussion one time with some consultants on solar, and they were actually against solar because it will disrupt the distribution utility companies who will pay for the DU installations. But we're looking at this not by destroying the entire setup of the DUs, but really by addressing the additional capacity that will be needed in the future. Now, this one is, I think, the most important slide that we have here, because we do have a law, and the law is the Renewable Energy Act, okay? And that means that all renewable energy will be dispatched ahead of any other energy, okay, as far as power is concerned. But up to now, we don't have actually an IRR at this point. And that's what we're trying to come up with a model on mass dispatch. In other words, you'll be the first one to be dispatched and you'll be price taker. But one thing we do realize, and this is not really indicated in the Renewable Energy Act, is that we do realize that renewable energy, most of them, like wind and solar, are intermittent in nature. In other countries, the government takes the cudgel of projections. We're trying to do it differently by actually asking the proponents to do their own projections. But what if there's a shortfall in their projections? Then that's also the reason why we're establishing the not only the renewable energy market, but also the reserve market at this point. Because the reserve market and the mass dispatch, as far as the policy of the government is concerned, work hand in hand. We intend to launch the reserve market for power by March 26th of this year. And 2 months after, that's an ideal situation, 2 months after, we actually also release the mass dispatch rule for renewable energy. That is the only way we can see this moving forward. Otherwise, if we don't have these two markets, okay, everybody will be looking at the government for subsidy in terms of renewable energy. So we'd like to put that on a market-driven economy. And of course, the issuance of renewable portfolio standard, it also goes hand in hand with the renewable energy market. In other words, instead of actually requiring people to come up with, basically complying with the renewable portfolio standard, why not have a renewable energy market where people can actually buy whatever it is that they need to comply with the laws that we have in this country. And promotion of energy efficiency. You know, when I actually meet people along the lines of building administrator, it's easy. We can teach them, we can provide them with technology, but the most difficult part to actually teach at this point in this country are the consumers themselves. Very difficult in the sense that it's difficult to predict when people are going to use electricity. In this country, when we have a growth rate, we also have the propensity to actually use electricity at proportions that is very difficult to actually predict. I mean, under the bridge, you will see shanties, they have air conditioning units. Okay, people buy television at the rate that we can't imagine. People use electricity, and one thing that's missing in the country really is for them to be conscious about electricity usage. And that's why we launched this website to tell everybody that, hey, before you buy any appliance, check out this website. Because in this website, it'll ask you, for example, if you wanted a television, for example, 32-inch, and then it'll ask you how many hours you use in a day, and then it will show you in the end, when you look when you click search, it will show you all the products that you describe, okay, and the estimated amount that you will be paying depending on wherever you are in this country. In other words, we don't deal with watts when it comes to consumers. We always deal with peso because that's the only thing they understand. Okay, so this particular website is actually just a series of websites that we created because we'd like to believe that we have a deregulated energy industry. But I always tell everybody that if we have a deregulated energy industry, and we're talking about power, we're talking about consumption, we're talking about oil prices and LPG, I always tell everybody that if we have to have a deregulated industry, I think in partner with that is that we also should have a transparency policy because they go hand in hand. And the only way to do that really is to put it on the website because the websites will exist long after I'm gone as a secretary. And I keep on telling everybody that even when I first became a secretary here, my first statement was, when I leave this office and people were saying, you just got in. And I tell everybody that in this country, whether you're holding a position, elected position or an appointed position, okay, the premise is that you will not stay here forever. The sooner you can accept that, the better you can actually perform. And that's what we'd like to put into this place. It's not the secretary, it's not the people who are in the cabinet right now that will make this work. It's actually the system that we leave behind. And that's our focus right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Vinod. I'd like to encourage everyone to make use of Pigeonhole Live, but we've received some questions. You know, you haven't started, you just sat on your chair and questions started coming in for you. So let me ask, you've answered actually one of the top questions, so let me go to this one. And maybe you have touched a bit on it in your presentation, but the Philippines is one of the few countries that doesn't have energy saving standards. We are being bombarded with garbage from China. Isn't it time to change that?
We've talked about it, but this falls within not only in the energy sector, but also in Department of Trade. Because in the end, okay, the consumer items to some extent are really, there's an overlap of the coverage of energy and DTI, Department of Trade and Industry. On our end, we're actually moving towards labeling right now. We actually have a labeling project. We now label energy efficient, the number one consumer of electricity in terms of appliances, air conditioning unit and refrigeration. And that's why we have this labeling right now. We call it the yellow label. And I think where we're trying to push this forward is making people aware of it because we have the yellow label, but in this country, most people understand that there's a black label, but not a yellow label. So perhaps it's information dissemination that please look at the yellow tag, the yellow label. But we're actually expanding towards other products. But I think the website that we have put in place is just a starting point. But we do intend to make people aware of energy efficiency in this country when it comes to appliance.
Now, this next question is for Simon. Simon, how can global companies like Shell enable or foster better collaboration between governments in developing energy resources?
It's a good question. One of the answers is by holding events like this and having an open dialogue with governments around the world, but also other important opinion formers. And I think there are many good examples of that taking place, whether it's around technology development, policy development, or other aspects. If I may, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that people made and build on them. And one of the points, I think, is about pricing of resources. Vinod made the point about $500 billion of subsidies for energy. I think that's just for fossil fuel. It doesn't actually include subsidies for renewables, for example. And this is nearly all in developing economies. And getting pricing right will make a difference to the amount people consume. I agree entirely with the Secretary that people care about pesos, not watts or barrels of oil. And the fact that water is being priced at a higher level than oil when we drink it is an important signal, but in many countries it is free at the point of use for agriculture. So finding a way for Shell to enter into that debate, talk about market mechanisms, as a believer in free trade, but regulatory frameworks and market mechanisms that price resources and encourage that innovative spirit, entrepreneurial thinking, to not follow a particular definition of wind power is the way to go, but to say what is the best allocation of resources to reduce carbon emissions if they're being priced properly and energy is being priced into the consumer. Because that drives everything: efficiency, technology development, and long-term acceptance by society. So if we can create the right debate, help set the right market mechanisms, and then make the most of them, that's the best things we can do.
Now a question for Brahma. How far are we from developing unconventional ways of water sourcing in Asia in particular?
We are being forced to develop unconventional sources of water. For example, if you take Singapore, it's a good example of a little city-state which has taken the lead in Asia to develop unconventional sources of supply. They have reckoned that the political cost of Singapore staying dependent on Malaysia for water is high, so they have invested heavily in three technologies. One is recycling wastewater. Second, they are also desalinating ocean water. And third, they're big on rainwater harvesting. So they've opened three sources of supply whose costs are significant because the costs are much higher than conventional water. But what Singapore is doing, a number of other communities and states are doing in Asia. For example, in the two southern Indian cities of Chennai and Bangalore, all new apartment buildings by law are required to have rainwater harvesting system in place. Now this is just one example of many how communities are being forced to change their business as usual outlook and embrace unconventional methods. Rainwater harvesting is an ancient, low-cost technique that was actually developed in Asia way back in the 9th and the 10th centuries. So Asia really needs to readopt its old technique of harvesting rainwater. The world's water resources are finite, and nature has a finite capacity to renew water. That capacity is 43,000 billion cubic meters of water annually. But we get 2.5 times that amount in precipitation, mainly rainfall. So even if we just harvest 5% of the annual rainfall without disturbing the ecological uses of rain, we would actually increase global water supply by 13%. Just 5% harvesting of rainwater increases supply by 13%. So there's so many promising practices and techniques. It all requires a change in attitude. It requires changing our practices. Many people say, we have to wait for new technologies. No, we have practices currently. If they are adopted, if our human behavior changes, we can move towards sustainable development.
Vinod, now here's a question that you may want to address. Political change is a key factor in influencing this stress nexus. How do we overcome this in Asia to ensure the nexus is being consistently addressed?
If I may take this in relation to Simon's point, which was very important on subsidies, that's a practical example. I'm not sure if this is controversial or not, but let me make my point. When it comes to fossil fuels, those that inflict a harm on those who are not doing the production, there is a case to tax it, let alone not to subsidize it, right? I mean, subsidizing is go ahead and do more damage to the others in your product. So the good economic analysis says that not only do you not subsidize, you might even consider tax. And the carbon tax is also the same thing. The political economy of doing that is very hard if you have lobbies and political interests that are entrenched and large, the two going together. Then you really need a massive effort, including participatory public opinion to make that change. This event is not a minor show. It's not yet another event. Bringing this together in this forum and with such great practitioners here is a big deal. But the distinction I also want to make, and again, all of us may not agree on it, but when it comes to the other side of the coins, like renewables, they, in principle, do not inflict a harm on CO2 and carbon emissions, but they actually can inflict a benefit. So there is a case, not for taxing, but for subsidizing. So if you see that, why you tax fossil fuels and why would you subsidize renewables? The basic difference is the fundamental economics of this, that on the right side you have a public goods which you want to promote, on the left side you have a public bad which you want to discourage. Now, it doesn't mean that the subsidies to renewables are being used in the most brilliant way. I'm sure a lot of ways it does not justify wastage. There too, special interests and vested groups will develop to support bad use of subsidies. And subsidies that once you provide is very hard to get rid of, fertilizer subsidy and so on, which would be, in the first instance, good for food production. And we talked about the Philippines in that context. It's a positive things, but you need to phase them out because eventually it only benefits the bigger farmers and not necessarily lead to benefits. So the political economy is a tough one, but highly differentiated in their potential use.
I'm sure you want to comment on that, being there to have that balancing act.
Yes, because the basic problem that we have right now is when we went into deregulation, for example, on oil. So every day or every week when oil prices, actually in this country, when oil prices go up, okay, people complain. And they blame the Department of Energy in a deregulated industry. And when it goes down, nobody bothers me. Nobody even congratulates me. But that is the attitude of the people. But at the same time, you're right, it actually curtails your use of fossil fuel because in a sense, you're actually paying for the real cost. And it's also being taxed. At the same time, if you look at the feed-in tariff that we have for renewables, it's actually to some extent subsidized because there's a fixed price for that. Okay? And people will not come into that if they're not going to make money. And they've done their equation. They're guaranteed, by the way, and it will be shouldered by the rest of the country. Now, when it comes to power, this is something that's been debated several times in this country because we have the most expensive power in Asia, next to Japan probably, and the same with Singapore. But in one of the forums I attended with some ASEAN ministers, okay, they actually asked me how we did it in the Philippines. And I said, did what? That you don't have any subsidy. Because in this country, we really don't have any subsidy. And subsidy, to some extent, is very good if you have a small economy, but if you have a rapidly growing economy, it becomes a bit of a problem because the subsidy goes forever. And you cannot take out subsidy. It will cause a riot or it can even topple a government for that matter. So, but at the same time, okay, there are industries, there are lifeline users that also need to be subsidized. So where to put the subsidy is a policy that this government is trying to look for in terms of do we actually focus it to everybody or certain areas where it's actually needed? And that's a great debate that we're having right now.
This question asks you to elaborate more on your presentation earlier. It says, the Philippines is suffering from energy shortage, has been suffering from energy shortage for years, but DOE's focus remains on putting up power plants. Isn't it obvious that we must also be more aggressive with off-grid like solar? Well, you did touch on that earlier, but you might want to elaborate more on this.
A lot of people are asking the government to push for renewables, and we are pushing for renewables right now. In fact, I think one of the stumbling blocks where renewables did not really progress that much is because we don't have the renewable energy market, okay, or the mass dispatch rule, which we're actually putting in place quite quickly.
Middle of this year.
Middle of this year, okay. But we have to understand that we need the market for that because renewables by themselves cannot stand on their own. In other words, they're intermittent in some nature that you need to couple it with base load in this country. unfortunately, the only base load that we have right now available is really diesel and coal. And that's why we're actually pushing for LNG as another source. You know, the coal plants that are coming in are, you know, it's scary if you look at it. But the problem is, what are the alternatives that we have? I'd like to put a policy on mix, but if you don't have alternatives for the mix, okay, you're really constraining something that's actually needed at this point. That's why we're trying to come up with a master plan, because it won't stop with just one LNG, it won't stop with Shell. It will have to be a master plan going for 20 years, for example. Now, the question is, people are saying, are you pushing for coal? Because sometimes I'm actually mistaken as a coal boy with the right spelling. I'm simply trying to say that we push renewables, but we actually push renewables that there has to be a complementing baseload in place. And that's what we're doing right now. The alternatives for baseload are limited. We're trying to expand it right now. People are saying geothermal. We do have geothermal. The second biggest geothermal producing country is actually the Philippines. But when you look at the profile of the geothermal, the installed capacity is just under 2,000 megawatts. The potential up to 2030 is only 3,000 megawatts.
Why?
Because that's the only available that we have resources. If you actually survey the potential, we're talking about the potential, okay? Because it's not as if you can put a geothermal plant just anywhere in this country. There has to be an economic reason why you can actually put up a geothermal plant there. And the potential is really up to just 3,000 megawatts. And that's why we have to look for alternative sources of baseload that are not concentrated on coal and diesel.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's move to water, Brahma. You talked about water being used as a weapon. What are the flashpoints in Asia in terms of having all these conflicts?
Shared water has become a source of increasing tension and competition between riparian neighbors in Asia. And Asia is, given the fact that water shortages are beginning to impact socio-economic development in Asia, and politically, water has been turned into a potential instrument by some countries, especially those are located upstream. Those that are located upstream can use water as a potential weapon. One way they can do that is by withholding data on water flows, on river flows in a critical season like the flood season.
Mm-hmm. Can you be more specific? Which countries in particular?
Well, if you look at the bigger picture in Asia, there's one country that dominates the water picture, the one that I showed. China is the dominant upper riparian. In fact, it has an unparalleled situation in the world. There is no other country in the world that is a supplier of water to 12 different neighbors as China is. That makes China's riparian position unique in the world. It is an unmatched hydro-hegemon in that respect. Thing about China is that it is a country that for the last 3 decades has been ruled by engineers. Ever since Li Peng, a hydro engineer, became the premier in the mid-1980s, we have seen a domination of political decision-making in China by engineers. For the last 3 presidents, including the current one, is an engineer. And engineers are supply-side people. You give them a problem, they will build the structure to resolve it. So China has been focusing a lot on dam building. Dams have become the source of political tensions in Asia. China has more dams than the rest of the world combined today. So it is the most dammed country in the world, literally. But far from the dam building spree slowing, it has picked up momentum, because as China has begun to experience serious water shortages in the north, the temptation to take water from the south to the north has increased. So China has this huge project called the Great South-North Water Diversion Project, taking water from the Yangtze River Basin to the Yellow River Basin. The first leg of that project, called the Eastern Route, became operational last year, began transferring water from the Yangtze Basin to the Yellow River. In the second phase, they're going to take water again from the same region to the north. And the third phase, they plan to take water from the Tibetan Plateau to the north. That will be the most controversial because the Tibetan Plateau is the source of rivers for much of Asia. And the first two legs involve internal rivers. The third leg involves international rivers. So what China does on the Tibetan Plateau will have important implications. But China is not the only country which has disputes with its neighbors. India is upper riparian, lower riparian, and mid riparian. It has disputes with its neighbors. The difference is that India has water sharing treaties with Pakistan and with Bangladesh, which are located downstream. So if there are disputes, they can invoke the lower riparian countries can invoke international arbitration. For example, Pakistan has invoked against India by setting up an international court of arbitration. But China's neighbors do not have this kind of an option, in the sense that China has not entered into any water sharing arrangement with any neighboring country. And in the Middle East, we have Turkey as a dominant upper riparian, and we have Israel vis-a-vis its Arab neighbors, especially Syria and Jordan, as the dominant upper riparian. So you have in different zones the dominant upper riparian being the source of dam building, and in turn being the trigger for rising political tensions. So the only way you can actually address these tensions is by investing in institutionalized cooperation, by building norms and rules. If you don't have norms and rules, therefore, in that situation, tensions will rise, and the possibility of competition escalating to conflict increases.
Now, talking about cooperation, I'd like to shift gears a bit, and this is a question maybe Simon and Vinod can answer. In terms of collaboration between the government and the private sector, Vinod, from a multilateral point of view, and of course from a private sector point of view, when governments and the private sector work in different timelines, I'm sure you've experienced that, how do you engender then cooperation between the private sector and government? Vinod, would you like to go ahead, and then Simon next?
So when it comes to these issues, the big dilemma is that the private sector is the engine of growth. Some of the organizations, the World Bank, ADB, Inter-American Development Bank in Latin America, etc., they work primarily, but not exclusively, with the public sector. So when you talk about sustainable energy, when you talk about inclusive growth to include the poorer sections of the population, a big issue in the Philippines, the public sector can do a lot of different things, but unless the private sector does the same, all bets are off, really. For example, in inclusive growth, the number of World Bank or ADB public sector projects will just scratch the surface if the private sector projects are not inclusive. Now, the private sector has interest in the bottom line, and can it have an interest in a triple bottom line, and then can the ADBs and the World Banks align with that? And I must say here, actually some of the better examples are from the private sector, not the public sector, but they are examples. And the real question is, can we scale this up? Can this become more the norm than the exception? So very transparently, very frankly, our job is to evaluate World Bank and ADB projects. When we do that, we see good examples of private sector becoming inclusive so that the bottom 40% benefit, and the objective of the project is to do that. And we have some good examples in the Philippines. I think the social protection one on the conditional cash transfers in the Philippines, that does meet that criterion. But those are just examples, and 1 year you have a very high percentage going that way. But taking the whole 20-year picture, it's still the exception. So the question would be, private sector is the key. Private sector has the better examples, but the scale is just driven only by the vision of one leader or someone who feels that way, as opposed to a triple bottom line as being good for business, good for the environment, and good for inclusion, period. How do we make that shift?
Simon, do you have the answer?
Oh, that's very well said. I agree with everything that Vinod has said, but I think the private sector is, by definition, almost the actor that delivers within a framework set by governments. Governments are rarely the investors, they're rarely the operators, but they need to set the environment. So we look for, first of all, long-term stability. In some countries, it's more important to be sure about stability and minimum changes than it is as to whether the rules that are stable are actually sensible or not. Because the private sector can work around rules that don't make sense in the first instance to create something that actually will persist over many decades. But what the private sector cannot live with is volatility and uncertainty, because essentially we take risk, we price risk in the investments we make and the price we charge, and the uncertainty increases risk and it increases the price we have to charge, quite often to the point where it's either unacceptable to the customers or to the people who provide finance to us. So again, we look for stability on market mechanisms, we look for stability on fiscal frameworks, and importantly, increasingly, regulatory standards, whether they are environmental standards, they are engineering standards, or they are standards associated with, for example, CO2 emissions. But once they have been set, let's have that stability. Let's not, we'll find a mechanism where a new government cannot completely change what a previous government has just done, and enable the private sector to find solutions. And I think as the primary actor when it comes to investment and operation, governments must work with the private sector just to understand what it takes for us to do that investment.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure ECOT is very well aware of that. The task is very clear for you. We'd like to now ask each one of you to give us your 20-second soundbite, what you'd like our audience to take with them, to chew over lunch. So, shall I start with you, ECOT?
Okay, 20 seconds, the stuff, but let me just say that the government is here to actually ask the private sector, what will it take for you to actually come on board and do your projects? Because in the end, we do not dictate, we can only follow what is doable in this case. And it's mostly private sector now that are actually implementing them. So the question is, how can we help?
Vinod?
I think the world's eyes are fixed on economic growth rate. Asia, is it growing at 6%? Philippines, 7%. How long will it continue? I agree with that focus as a very partial measure. That growth rate cannot be sustained unless there is harmony among energy, water, and food, requiring policies for the private sector and the public sector to come together, and making some tough political economy decisions which might reduce the benefits to some, but it certainly increase the benefits to the economy. The growth rate projections of today will not be achieved unless there is a single-minded focus on energy that is more sustainable and that will address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, and deal with natural disasters, which are going to call all bets off unless addressed.
Brahma.
The short-term developmental objectives and the long-term human aspirations, the gap between the two, suggests that we are passing on the cost of development increasingly to future generations. The water, food, energy nexus is at the heart of the sustainable development challenge that we face. And the real challenge basically is that we put too much emphasis on one benchmark of development, GDP growth, and we neglect other indices of development, which include resource sustainability, environmental protection, social equity, low income disparity, etc. By overemphasizing GDP growth, we are promoting ever-increasing production and consumption. Even more than population growth, it is the increasing consumption of human beings, the increasing per capita consumption. That is the main driver of resource stresses and environmental degradation. We need to find a more balanced approach to development. Human development should be measured not only in GDP terms, but also by how well human needs are being met by any society.
Thank you very much, Brahma. Finally, Simon.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. Consume less is a good way of addressing the stresses. The triangle, government, business, civil society is core to achieving the outcome that I think we all would seek here, a more sustainable future. And what I said at the beginning, I think both the stresses and the potential solutions are greatest potential here in Asia. I genuinely believe that it will be those stressors, and the fact that despite the Secretary's, I think, very valid observation about the short-term tenure, the discussion between those three elements here in Asia is much more productive, constructive, and longer-term thinking than it is in many Western economies at the moment, which gives me actually great confidence that many of the solutions will come from this part of the world, and I look forward to certainly Shell being part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you for that very positive ending to our discussion here. Gentlemen, do stay with me because I'd like to bring you to the grounds outside. If you noticed on your way here, ladies and gentlemen, there was a frenzy of activity at what we call the Luneta grounds, which is where fronting the national monument, or the monument of our national hero. So we have a reporter who went around, and let's watch her report.
Are enjoying yourselves at the forum. I'm here now in the historic Luneta Park, where you can see the streets have been transformed into a massive track exclusively for the Shell Eco Marathon, where over 100 student teams have taken on the challenge to design and build a car that will travel the farthest distance, hopefully with the least amount of fuel. And we are very fortunate now to have with us one of the teams that will be competing. It's an all-girls team from Brunei. Hi, girls.
Hi.
Okay, they are team PLM Alpha 2, and we are going to talk to City, the team manager. Hi, City.
Hi.
How are you feeling?
Good.
You're feeling good. Okay, so tell us, how does it feel to be an all-girls team in this male-dominated challenge?
As an all-girls team, wait,
Do you feel the pressure? Is it more exciting?
more exciting, and hopefully we can do the best. We will do the best.
Yeah, you'll do the best you can, right? Okay, tell us about the process that went into this. How long did it take from designing to actual finish?
We take around 6 months
Okay.
to finish, to complete this, to complete the car.
Okay, the hardest part.
The hardest.
What's the hardest part about it?
I guess
Which one?
I guess
the brake
set the
system.
brake system.
Oh, that was tough. Okay, what else? Any cat fights? Any arguments within the group? No? You got along together
Yes.
well?
Yes.
That's great. So how excited are all of you for the actual race?
Very
Oh yeah, we have our driver here. How are you feeling?
I'm very excited.
Oh, excited with a little nervousness I can sense. Well, good luck, girls. I hear you have a team chant, so can we hear it?
Sure. Yes.
Take it away.
Be better, be faster, be extraordinary. Go Brunei!
Be extraordinary. Good luck, girls. Thank you very much for joining. Give yourselves a big warm applause. Of course, we wish this team good luck and all the teams participating. We will go back to the forum, guys.
Well, thank you very much. That was Bianca Gonzalez, and you know who the girls are rooting for in this room. Go Team Brunei. From an oil-producing country at that. Amazing. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Before we go, some housekeeping. Lunch will be served at the Manila Ballroom. That's just walk out the doors, and to your left, there will be hostesses as well to bring you to refuel. You know, for the rest of the afternoon, we still have a long day ahead. And thank you to these 4 gentlemen. Let's give them a big hand for their insights and their passion. All right, and be back here 1:30 this afternoon sharp. See you.